The sky was on fire. Not with the warm, golden hues of a sunset, but with the harsh, blinding light of destruction. Smoke curled into the atmosphere like the tendrils of some great beast, choking the air and blotting out the stars. Below, the streets were eerily silent, save for the distant echo of footsteps and the occasional crackle of flames devouring what was left of the world. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Humanity had always been told to hope, to wait, to trust that someone, anyone, would come to save them. But no one came. And now the time for waiting was over. It started with whispers. Whispers of a power no one could explain, a force that defied the laws of nature and the cold, calculating logic of the ones who had brought the world to its knees. They called it the spark. No one knew where it came from or why it chose the people it did, but those who felt it, they changed. They became something more. Something unstoppable. It wasn't just strength or speed or intelligence, it was something deeper, something primal. It was the unshakable will to survive, to fight, to rise. And rise they did. In the beginning they were scattered, isolated. A farmer in the middle of nowhere, a mechanic in a crumbling city, a student in a forgotten town, each of them felt it, a surge of energy that burned through their veins like wildfire. At first they thought they were alone. But the spark had a way of connecting them, drawing them together like moths to a flame. They didn't know each other, didn't trust each other, but they shared one thing, a refusal to bow. They were done with empty promises, done with being told to sit quietly while the world burned around them. This was their time. Their revolution. But revolutions aren't born without cost. The ones who had ruled from the shadows, the ones who had watched with cold indifference as humanity struggled, they weren't about to let go of their power. They had weapons, armies, technology that seemed like magic to the rest of the world. And they weren't afraid to use it. The first strikes were brutal, calculated to crush hope before it could take root. Entire cities were wiped off the map, their names erased from history. The message was clear, resistance was futile. But the spark didn't care about messages. It didn't care about fear. It only cared about one thing, survival. And so the fight began. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't heroic. It was messy, desperate, and raw. But it was real. For the first time in generations, humanity wasn't just surviving, it was fighting back. The ones who had been ignored, forgotten, cast aside, they were the ones leading the charge. They didn't have fancy titles or shiny armor. They had nothing but the fire in their hearts and the unshakable belief that they could win. And that belief was enough. But as the battles raged on, something began to change. The spark wasn't just a gift, it was a test. It pushed them, challenged them, forced them to confront the darkest parts of themselves. Some couldn't handle it. The weight of the power, the responsibility, the fear, it broke them. But others rose to the challenge. They became more than just fighters. They became leaders, symbols, beacons of hope in a world that had forgotten what hope looked like. And as their numbers grew, so did their power. The spark wasn't just changing them, it was changing the world. But the ones in the shadows weren't idle. They had seen this before, or so they thought. They had crushed rebellions, silenced dissent, and snuffed out hope countless times before. But this was different. This wasn't just another uprising. This was something they couldn't predict, couldn't control. And that scared them. For the first time, they began to wonder if they had underestimated humanity, if they had made a mistake. And then the unthinkable happened. One of their own, a soldier, a weapon, a tool, defected. They didn't know why. They didn't know how. But they knew one thing, this changed everything. The defector brought with them secrets, knowledge, a glimpse into the heart of the enemy. And what they revealed was more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The ones in the shadows weren't just powerful, they were desperate. And desperate people do desperate things. As the revolution gained momentum, the stakes grew higher. The battles became bloodier, the losses more devastating. But through it all, the spark burned brighter. It was no longer just a force, it was a symbol. A symbol of defiance, of unity, of hope. And hope, as it turned out, was the most dangerous weapon of all. But even as the flames of rebellion spread, a shadow loomed on the horizon. The ones in the shadows had one last card to play, one final weapon that could wipe out the spark, and humanity, once and for all. The revolution had come so far, fought so hard, but the hardest battle was yet to come. And as the world held its breath, one question burned in the hearts of every fighter, every survivor, every person who dared to hope. Could they win? Or was this the end? The answer, as it turned out, was closer than anyone realized. But it would come at a cost that would change everything. And as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a fight for the soul of humanity. And humanity wasn't about to let go. But the clock was ticking. The enemy was moving. And the spark was growing restless. Something was coming. Something big. And when it arrived, nothing would ever be the same. The defectors' arrival sent shockwaves through the ranks of the revolution. No one had expected it, least of all the ones who had been fighting tooth and nail to survive. They had grown used to being the underdogs, the forgotten, the ones who had nothing to lose. But this changed everything. The defector wasn't just a soldier. They were a living, breathing piece of the enemy's puzzle. And the secrets they carried were enough to make even the most hardened fighters pause. At first, no one trusted them. How could they? The scars of betrayal ran deep, and the wounds of war were still fresh. But as the defector began to speak, as they revealed the truth about the ones in the shadows, the resistance began to listen. It wasn't just about the weapons or the tactics or the technology. It was about the why. Why had the world been brought to its knees? Why had humanity been left to suffer? And why now, after all this time, had the spark appeared? The answers were as terrifying as they were enlightening. The ones in the shadows weren't just rulers. They were survivors of a long-forgotten age. An age where humanity had reached the peak of its power, only to tear itself apart in a war that left the world in ruins. They had watched from the sidelines, biding their time, waiting for the right moment to step in and take control. And when they did so with a cold, calculated precision that left no room for resistance. They had seen humanity at its worst, and they had no intention of letting it rise again. But the spark was something they hadn't accounted for. It wasn't just a random mutation or a fluke of nature. It was a response, a desperate, primal response to the threat that loomed over the world. It was humanity's last hope, a final chance to prove that they were more than just their mistakes. And as the defectors spoke, as they revealed the true nature of the spark, the resistance began to understand. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for redemption. But understanding didn't make the fight any easier. If anything, it made it harder. The ones in the shadows had been preparing for this moment for centuries. They had weapons that could level cities, armies that could crush nations, and a network of spies that reached into every corner of the world. And now, with the defectors' knowledge, they knew exactly where to strike. The first attack came without warning. A small village on the edge of the resistance's territory was wiped out in a matter of hours. There were no survivors, no witnesses, just ash and silence. The message was clear. The ones in the shadows were done playing games. They were coming for the spark, and they wouldn't stop until it was extinguished. The resistance was shaken, but not broken. If anything, the attack only strengthened their resolve. They had seen what the enemy was capable of, and they knew that they couldn't afford to lose. But they also knew that they couldn't win alone. The spark had brought them together, but it was up to them to keep it alive. And that meant making sacrifices. The defector was the first to step forward. They had seen the enemy's tactics firsthand, and they knew how to counter them. But their knowledge came at a price. The ones in the shadows had marked them as a traitor, and they would stop at nothing to see them dead. The resistance knew that keeping the defector alive was a risk, but it was a risk they were willing to take. They needed every advantage they could get. As the days turned into weeks, the resistance began to grow. Word of the spark spread like wildfire, drawing in people from all walks of life. Farmers, teachers, engineers, artists, they all came drawn by the promise of something greater. They didn't have much, but they had each other. And that was enough. But as their numbers grew, so did the challenges. The ones in the shadows weren't just attacking from the outside, they were sowing discord from within. Spies and saboteurs infiltrated the resistance, spreading lies and turning allies against each other. Trust became a rare commodity, and paranoia began to creep into every decision. The resistance knew that they couldn't afford to fracture, but the pressure was relentless. And then there was the spark itself. It was powerful, yes, but it was also unpredictable. Some could harness it with ease, while others struggled to control it. And then there were those who couldn't handle it at all. The spark wasn't just a gift, it was a burden. And for some, it was too much to bear. One by one, the resistance began to lose people. Some fell in battle, their spark extinguished before it could reach its full potential. Others were consumed by the power, their minds and bodies unable to withstand the strain. And then there were those who simply disappeared. No one knew where they went or why they left, but their absence was felt all the same. But through it all, the resistance held on. They had come too far to give up now. And as they prepared for the next battle, they knew that it would be their hardest yet. The ones in the shadows were closing in, and the spark was growing restless. Something was coming. Something big. And when it arrived, nothing would ever be the same. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. The resistance had been pushed to its limits, and every step forward felt like a battle against an invisible force. The spark, once a source of hope, now felt like a ticking time bomb. It pulsed within them, restless and unpredictable, as if it knew what was coming. And maybe it did. Maybe it had always known. The defector had become a key figure in the resistance, their knowledge of the enemy proving invaluable. But their presence was a double-edged sword. Every plan they suggested, every strategy they proposed, was met with suspicion. Could they be trusted? Or was this all part of some elaborate trap? The defector never flinched under the scrutiny, their calm demeanor only adding to the unease. They had seen too much, endured too much, to be rattled by doubt. But the resistance couldn't afford to be careless. One wrong move, one misplaced trust, and it could all come crashing down. The ones in the shadows were growing bolder. Their attacks were no longer just about destruction, they were about sending a message. They wanted the resistance to know that they were watching, that they were always one step ahead. And they were. Every move the resistance made seemed to be anticipated, every plan thwarted before it could even begin. It was as if the enemy could see into their minds, could predict their every thought. The defector warned them about this, about the enemy's ability to infiltrate and manipulate. But knowing and stopping were two very different things. And then there was the spark. It was changing, evolving in ways no one could have predicted. Those who carried it felt it growing stronger, more volatile. It wasn't just a source of power anymore, it was a force of its own, with a will that seemed to push back against their control. Some began to fear it, to question whether it was truly a gift or a curse. But others embraced it, letting it fuel their determination, their rage, their hope. The spark was a part of them, and they would not let it be taken away. The Resistance's base of operations had become a fortress, a makeshift stronghold carved out of the ruins of an old city. It was far from perfect, but it was theirs. Walls of scrap metal and concrete rose around them, patrolled day and night by those who could still fight. Inside, the atmosphere was a mix of desperation and determination. People moved with purpose, their faces set in grim determination. They knew what was at stake. They knew what was coming. The defector had been working on a plan, something risky, something that could turn the tide. It involved using the spark in a way no one had tried before, a way that could either save them or destroy them. The resistance leaders debated for hours, their voices rising in frustration and fear. Was it worth the risk? Could they afford not to take it? In the end, the decision was made. They would go forward with the plan. They had no other choice. Preparations began in secret, the details known only to a select few. The rest of the resistance was kept in the dark, not out of mistrust but out of necessity. The enemy's spies were everywhere, and even the slightest leak could doom them all. But secrets have a way of getting out, and it wasn't long before whispers began to spread. Whispers of a final stand, of a last, desperate attempt to strike back. The tension in the air grew thicker, the spark burning brighter in response. And then, the moment came. The enemy's forces were spotted on the horizon, a dark mass moving steadily closer. The resistance scrambled into position, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and adrenaline. This was it. This was what they had been preparing for. The defectors stood at the center of it all, their expression unreadable. They had been here before, on the other side of this fight. Now they were the ones leading the charge. The battle began with a deafening roar. The sky lighting up with explosions and the crackle of energy. The resistance fought with everything they had, their spark-fueled abilities pushing them beyond their limits. But the enemy was relentless, their weapons cutting through the resistance's defenses like paper. It was chaos, pure and unrelenting. And through it all, the spark burned brighter, its power surging through the fighters, driving them forward even as their bodies screamed for rest. The defectors' plan was put into motion, a risky maneuver that required perfect timing and precision. It involved channeling the spark into a single concentrated burst, a wave of energy that could disable the enemy's weapons and turn the tide of the battle. But it came at a cost. The ones who carried the spark would have to give everything they had, risking their lives to unleash its full potential. It was a sacrifice they were willing to make, but that didn't make it any easier. As the resistance fighters gathered their strength, the enemy closed in, their forces overwhelming. The defectors stood at the forefront, their voice cutting through the chaos as they directed the fighters into position. The moment was now. There was no turning back. The spark surged within them, a blinding light that seemed to consume everything. And then, with a deafening roar, it was unleashed. The wave of energy tore through the battlefield, a force so powerful it seemed to bend reality itself. The enemy's weapons faltered, their forces thrown into disarray. For a moment, it seemed like the resistance had done it. They had turned the tide. But the victory was short-lived. The enemy wasn't defeated, they were regrouping. And they were angry. The resistance fighters were exhausted, their bodies pushed to the brink. The spark, once a source of strength, now felt like a weight dragging them down. They had given everything they had and it still wasn't enough. The defectors' plan had bought them time, but time was running out. The enemy was coming and they were coming fast. As the resistance braced for the next wave, the spark began to flicker, its light dimming as if it too was feeling the strain. The fighters looked to each other, their faces etched with fear and determination. They had come so far, fought so hard. They couldn't give up now. But the enemy was relentless, their forces closing in with a precision that was almost inhuman. And then, just as it seemed like all hope was lost, something changed. The spark, which had been flickering and fading, suddenly surged back to life. It was different this time, brighter, more intense. It was as if it had been waiting for this moment, biding its time. The fighters felt it too, a renewed strength coursing through their veins. They didn't know what was happening, but they knew one thing. This wasn't over. The enemy hesitated, their advance slowing as they took in the sudden change. The resistance fighters stood their ground, their eyes blazing with the light of the spark. They were ready. They were willing. And they were not going down without a fight. But as the two forces prepared to clash once more, a new presence made itself known. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, a faint hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The fighters on both sides paused, their attention drawn to the sky. Something was coming. Something big. And when it arrived, nothing would ever be the same. The hum grew louder, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to echo in the bones of everyone on the battlefield. The sky, already darkened by smoke and ash, began to shimmer as if the air itself was alive. The resistance fighters froze, their spark-fueled energy flickering uncertainly. Even the enemy forces hesitated, their cold, mechanical precision faltering for the first time. Something was coming, something none of them had anticipated. Then it appeared. A massive structure, sleek and alien, descended from the clouds. It wasn't like anything the resistance had seen before. It wasn't one of the enemy's machines, nor was it a relic of humanity's past. This was something entirely new. The structure hovered silently, its surface reflecting the dim light of the dying sun. For a moment, the battlefield was eerily quiet, the tension so thick it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. The defectors' eyes widened, their usual calm demeanor cracking for the first time. This isn't possible, they muttered, their voice barely audible over the hum. They weren't supposed to come back. The resistance fighters turned to the defector, their faces a mix of confusion and fear. "What is it?" one of them demanded, their voice trembling. "What's happening?" The defector didn't answer right away. Their gaze was locked on the structure, their mind racing. Finally they spoke, their voice low and urgent. "It's them. The ones who came before. The ones who started all of this." The words sent a chill through the resistance. The ones who came before? What did that mean? They had always assumed the ones in the shadows were the ultimate enemy, the architects of humanity's downfall. But now it seemed there was something, or someone else. Something even more dangerous. The structure began to change, its smooth surface shifting and unfolding like a flower blooming in fast motion. From within a light emerged, blinding and pure. It wasn't like the harsh, artificial light of the enemy's weapons. This was something else entirely, something alive. The light pulsed, and with it came a wave of energy that washed over the battlefield. The resistance fighters felt it immediately, a surge of power that made the spark within them burn brighter than ever before. But it wasn't just power. It was knowledge, memories, emotions. It was as if the light was reaching into their very souls, showing them things they had never seen, things they had never known. Images flashed before their eyes, visions of a world long gone, a world where humanity had thrived, where the spark had once been a part of everyday life. They saw the rise and fall of civilizations, the wars that had torn the world apart, and the ones who had watched it all happen. The ones who had decided that humanity was too dangerous, too unpredictable, to be left unchecked. The ones who had created the ones in the shadows. The light faded, leaving the resistance fighters gasping for breath, their minds reeling from what they had just experienced. The defector was the first to recover, their expression grim. "They're the originals," they said, their voice heavy with dread. "The ones who created the ones in the shadows. They've been gone for centuries, but now they're back." The resistance fighters exchanged uneasy glances. This changed everything. The ones in the shadows had been bad enough, but this was something else entirely. These were the ones who had decided humanity's fate long before the spark had even existed. And now they were here to finish what they had started. The structure began to move again, its light shifting and focusing on the battlefield. From within, figures emerged, tall humanoid shapes made of light and shadow. They moved with a grace that was almost hypnotic, their presence both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The resistance fighters tightened their grip on their weapons, their spark-fueled energy flaring in response. But the figures didn't attack. Instead, they spoke, their voices echoing in the minds of everyone on the battlefield. "You have fought well," one of them said, their tone calm and measured. "But your struggle is meaningless. You cannot win. The spark was never meant to save you. It was meant to test you. And you have failed." The words hit like a physical blow, the resistance fighters stumbling back as if struck. Failed? What did that mean? They had fought so hard, sacrificed so much. How could they have failed? The defector stepped forward, their voice steady despite the fear in their eyes. "You don't get to decide that," they said, their words cutting through the tension. "We're not your experiment. We're not your pawns. We're human. And we're not giving up." The figures regarded the defector with something that might have been amusement. "Brave words," one of them said. "But bravery will not save you. The spark was never yours to control. It was ours. And now we will take it back." The light around the figures intensified, and the resistance fighters felt it immediately, a pull, a tugging at the very core of their being. The spark within them was being drawn out, pulled toward the figures. They fought against it, their bodies trembling with the effort, but it was no use. The spark was slipping away, and with it, their strength, their hope, their will to fight. But just as it seemed like all was lost, something unexpected happened. The spark, which had been fading, suddenly flared back to life. It wasn't just a flicker this time, it was a blaze, a fire that burned brighter than ever before. The resistance fighters felt it, a surge of energy that pushed back against the pull of the figures. The spark wasn't just resisting, it was fighting back. The figures hesitated, their calm demeanor faltering for the first time. This is impossible," one of them said, their voice tinged with disbelief. "The spark should not be able to resist us." The defector smiled, a fierce, determined smile. "You underestimated us," they said. "You underestimated humanity. The spark isn't just yours. It's ours. And we're not letting it go." The battlefield erupted into chaos as the resistance fighters, fueled by the renewed strength of the spark, launched themselves at the figures. The ones in the shadows who had been watching from the sidelines hesitated, unsure of what to do. The balance of power had shifted, and no one knew what would happen next. But even as the resistance fought with everything they had, they knew this wasn't over. The figures were powerful, more powerful than anything they had faced before. And they were just the beginning. The ones who had created the ones in the shadows were here, and they weren't going to stop until the spark was extinguished, and humanity along with it. The stakes had never been higher. The fight had never been more desperate. And as the resistance prepared for the next wave, they knew one thing for certain. This was their last stand. They would either rise, or fall. The battlefield was a storm of light and shadow, the air crackling with energy as the resistance fought against the figures of light. The spark burned within them, a defiant flame that refused to be extinguished. But the figures were relentless, their power immense and otherworldly. Every strike, every surge of energy felt like it could be the last. The resistance was holding on, but just barely. The defector was at the heart of the chaos, their movements precise and calculated. They had been here before, in the heart of the enemy's power, and they knew how to fight it. But this was different. These figures weren't just enemies, they were creators, architects of humanity's suffering. And they were here to finish what they had started. As the battle raged on, the resistance fighters began to falter. The spark, though powerful, was taking its toll. Their bodies were breaking, their minds fraying under the strain. But they couldn't stop. They wouldn't stop. This was their last stand, their final chance to prove that humanity was more than just a failed experiment. And then something changed. The spark, which had been burning so fiercely, suddenly shifted. It wasn't just a source of power anymore, it was something more. It was a connection, a bond that tied the resistance fighters together. They could feel it, a surge of energy that flowed between them, linking their minds and their hearts. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for each other. For humanity. The figures of light hesitated, their movements slowing as they took in the change. This is not possible," one of them said, their voice tinged with uncertainty. "The spark was never meant to unite you. It was meant to divide you. To test you. The defector stepped forward, their voice steady despite the chaos around them. You made a mistake, they said, their words cutting through the noise. You thought the spark was just a tool, a way to control us. But it's more than that. It's a part of us. And you can't take that away. The figures recoiled, their light flickering as if the words had struck a nerve. But they weren't done yet. With a wave of their hands, they unleashed a wave of energy, a force so powerful it seemed to tear the very fabric of reality. The resistance fighters braced themselves, their spark-fueled energy flaring in response. But it wasn't enough. The wave hit them like a tidal wave, throwing them to the ground and extinguishing the spark within them. For a moment, everything was still. The battlefield was silent, the air heavy with the weight of defeat. The resistance fighters lay broken and battered, their bodies too weak to move. The figures of light stood over them, their expressions unreadable. It is over, one of them said, their voice cold and final. You have failed. But then, something unexpected happened. A single spark flickered to life, a tiny flame in the darkness. It was small, almost insignificant, but it was there. And then another. And another. The spark wasn't gone. It was still there, burning within the resistance fighters. It wasn't just a source of power, it was a part of them. And it wasn't about to give up. The resistance fighters began to rise, their bodies trembling with the effort. The spark within them burned brighter, fueled by their determination, their hope, their will to fight. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for humanity, for the future. And they weren't going to let it end like this. The figures of light hesitated, their confidence wavering for the first time. This is impossible, one of them said, their voice tinged with fear. The spark should not be able to resist us. The defector stepped forward, their eyes blazing with the light of the spark. You underestimated us, they said, their voice fierce and unyielding. You thought you could control us, break us, destroy us. But you were wrong. The spark isn't just a tool. It's a part of us. And you can't take that away. With a roar, the resistance fighters launched themselves at the figures, their spark-fueled energy blazing like a wildfire. The figures fought back, their power immense and overwhelming. But the resistance wasn't alone anymore. They were united, their bond stronger than ever. And together they were unstoppable. The battle was fierce, the air filled with the clash of light and shadow. But slowly, surely, the resistance began to gain the upper hand. The figures of light faltered, their power waning under the relentless assault. And then, with a final, blinding burst of energy, they were gone. The battlefield fell silent, the air heavy with the weight of what had just happened. The resistance fighters stood amidst the ruins, their bodies battered but unbroken. The spark within them burned brightly, a beacon of hope in the darkness. They had done it. They had won. But as they looked around, they realized something was wrong. The battlefield was empty, the enemy forces gone. But so were the ones in the shadows. The defector frowned, their expression grim. This isn't over, they said, their voice low and urgent. The ones in the shadows, they're still out there. And they're not going to stop. The resistance fighters exchanged uneasy glances. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The ones in the shadows were still out there, waiting, plotting. And now they knew the resistance's strength. They wouldn't make the same mistake twice. But for now the resistance had won. They had proven that humanity was more than just a failed experiment. They had proven that the spark wasn't just a tool, it was a part of them. And they weren't going to let it go. As they prepared for the next battle, they knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And they were ready. The victory on the battlefield was bittersweet. The resistance had stood against the figures of light, against the ones who had sought to control and destroy them, and they had won. But the cost had been high. The ground was littered with the remnants of the fight, scorched earth, shattered weapons, and the broken bodies of those who had given everything. The survivors stood amidst the wreckage, their faces etched with exhaustion and grief, but also with a quiet, unshakable determination. They had proven that humanity could rise, even from the ashes. But they also knew this was not the end. The defector moved among them, their presence a steadying force. They had been the bridge between the resistance and the truth, the one who had revealed the origins of the spark and the ones who had sought to control it. Now they were the voice of caution. The ones in the shadows are still out there, they said, their tone low but urgent. They've been watching, waiting. And they won't stop until the spark is extinguished, or until they find a way to control it. The resistance fighters nodded, their expressions grim. They had faced impossible odds before and they had survived. But this was different. The ones in the shadows were not just an enemy, They were a reflection of humanity's darkest moments, a reminder of what could happen if they lost their way. The resistance knew they couldn't afford to make the same mistakes. They had to be better. They had to be stronger. As the days passed, the resistance began to rebuild. Their makeshift stronghold, once a crumbling ruin, became a beacon of hope. People from all corners of the world began to arrive, drawn by the stories of the spark and the fight for humanity's future. They came with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the fire in their hearts, but they brought something invaluable: hope. Together they began to piece together a new world, one built not on fear or control but on unity and resilience. The spark, once a source of division and fear, became a symbol of their strength. It was no longer just a weapon or a tool, it was a part of who they were. The resistance fighters learned to harness it in new ways, not just for battle but for healing, for growth, for connection. They discovered that the spark was more than just energy, it was a reflection of their humanity, their will to survive, their capacity for love and compassion. But even as they rebuilt, the threat of the ones in the shadows loomed large. The defector worked tirelessly to uncover their plans, to find a way to stop them before they could strike again. It was a race against time, a battle of wits and wills. And then one day they found it, a hidden facility buried deep beneath the ruins of an old city. It was there that the ones in the shadows had been working on their final weapon, a device designed to extinguish the spark once and for all. The resistance knew they had to act fast. They couldn't let the weapon be completed. But the facility was heavily guarded, a fortress of technology and traps. It would take everything they had to breach it, and even then there were no guarantees. But they had no choice. This was their moment. Their last stand. The attack was swift and brutal. The resistance fighters moved as one, their spark-fueled energy blazing like a wildfire. They fought with everything they had, their determination unshakable. The ones in the shadows were prepared, their defenses formidable, but they had underestimated the resistance. They had underestimated the power of the spark, and the power of humanity. The battle raged on, the air filled with the clash of light and shadow. The resistance fighters pushed forward, their bond stronger than ever. They were not just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for each other, for the future, for the world they had fought so hard to rebuild. And then, finally, they reached the heart of the facility. The weapon was there, a massive, pulsating machine that seemed to hum with a malevolent energy. The defector stepped forward, their eyes narrowing as they studied it. "This is it," they said, their voice steady despite the chaos around them. "If we can destroy this, we can stop them. But it won't be easy." The resistance fighters didn't hesitate. They knew what they had to do. With a roar, they launched themselves at the machine, their spark-fueled energy surging as they unleashed everything they had. The machine fought back, its defenses activating with a terrifying precision. But the resistance was relentless. They had come too far to give up now. And then, with a final blinding burst of energy, the machine was destroyed. The facility shook, the walls crumbling as the weapon's power was unleashed in a massive explosion. The resistance fighters were thrown to the ground, their bodies battered but unbroken. For a moment, everything was still. And then the light faded. The ones in the shadows were gone, their power extinguished. The resistance had won. They had done the impossible. They had saved humanity. But as they stood amidst the ruins, they knew this was not the end. The fight had changed them, shaped them into something new. They had proven that humanity was more than just its mistakes, more than just its darkest moments. They had proven that the spark was not just a source of power, it was a source of hope. The resistance fighters returned to their stronghold, their hearts heavy but full. They had lost much, but they had gained more. They had found each other, and in doing so they had found themselves. The world was still broken, still scarred by the battles they had fought. But it was also alive, filled with the promise of a new beginning. As they looked to the future, they knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be more battles, more challenges, more moments of doubt and fear. But they also knew they were not alone. They had each other. They had the spark. And they had the unshakable belief that they could rise no matter what. The story of humanity was far from over. It was just beginning. And as the resistance fighters stood together, their eyes turned to the horizon. They knew one thing for certain. They were ready.